All right, Dev with Crime Hive, another true crime story of how they were caught. And before I get into this story, I want to remind you all that I do post regularly on my TikTok, and I did post about this story, but there is a lot more to it, which is why we're going to cover this on my podcast. And then also, if you're looking for any resources, whether it be privacy or safety concerns or anything in that realm, I do have some resources on my link tree. So it's link as in a website, linktree.com/crimehive, and check it out.
Crime Hive. True crime buzz.
This story really takes place in Florida. There's a lot of true crime stories in Florida. This one's in Brevard County. A judge would ultimately find a woman's body. This was in July of 2000. This judge owns some property near a river, and he saw something floating in the water, and he originally thought it was a manatee, which is interesting. I have heard reports of people thinking that a body is a mannequin, and when they look closer, they realize it's an actual body. But in this case, I don't know if it was due to the decomposition or the fact that she was in the water for some time, and she was unclothed. She was naked, and this judge would contact authorities, of course, and they would come out and investigate. And they did a very good job in this case, which we'll talk about. The forensics, the investigative work that ultimately caught the individual responsible for this really terrible crime, which you'll learn some other disturbing details at the end. But let's start at the beginning. You have this woman who police are looking at in the water. They're seeing that much of the evidence is destroyed, and sometimes criminals know this, and they know that water can destroy a lot of evidence. They see that there's no trauma to this victim. They're not seeing any serious injuries. They're not seeing broken bones or really any official cause of death. So what they do is they want to try to preserve as much evidence as possible. They send a professional dive team in, and they implemented a very interesting technique. They actually took a body bag with them in the water, and then they put the victim's body in the body bag to preserve possible evidence from the very beginning. They would bring her to shore, and they would learn that she had been duct taped around her eyes and her mouth. They found some white duct tape around her eyes and mouth, which is a little odd for that particular color. And that comes in handy later on for police. They also noticed that her arms and legs were bound by a nylon rope, and it was tied in a unique knot. It's like a clove hitch knot, very consistent with someone being in the Navy, is what they believe. Someone in the military that learned how to tie that specific knot with the combination of nylon rope that was typically used for boating in that area. So they're thinking somebody is familiar with boating, is familiar with the water, and possibly in the military. So they're gathering this information as they go along. They saw some shopping bags with rocks in them, and it seemed as if the suspect was trying to weigh down the victim, but the bags were just too flimsy, and that really didn't work out for that person. They find these bags. These bags actually have a very specific marking on them and a very specific number system from the manufacturer. So they're hoping they can get some information from that as well. And then they would conduct a drift test. I thought this was interesting. They actually used a bag of coconuts and they placed it out into the water. And through this test, they realized from the location of the body that it was in a very deep part of the river, which in that area was called the Black Hole. And so they surmised that the person who committed this crime most likely knew this area and most likely knew where would be a deep area to dump a body. So that was pretty interesting for them to come up with that information early on, along with the fact that they determined the body was most likely dropped off from a boat based on the location. So they're, again, documenting all this information. But a lot of the evidence was destroyed, again, due to the decomposition. They would look at some other ways to identify this woman. They knew it was a woman, but what they didn't have was an identification. They didn't have any identifiers to get out to the media, such as tattoos. Tattoos can be very helpful in identifying someone pretty early on. They used a very interesting technique. Some of you may find this technique disturbing, but it was how they were able to identify this woman. And it was from the technique called degloving. What forensic techs did was they actually removed the skin from her hand while keeping the prints intact. And then they would essentially pull this outer layer off of her skin. And then an individual would slide their hand into the person's skin to take the prints. Pretty disturbing, but it worked. And they were actually able to get some good fingerprints that happened to be in a police database because there was a misdemeanor arrest. They identified her as Misty Morse. They had to utilize that technique. I have heard of other forensic techniques where they can inject the hand with water to blow it up to be able to get prints, because the hands, they're very shriveled in the water for a long period of time. They're damaged, and they have to be able to roll these prints or get it in the electronic system to look at all the different aspects of the finger to identify who this is. They contact friends and family, and they learn that she was just a really nice person. She was identified as a friend magnet to some, really liked people and liked to talk with people and had an easy way of making friends. And she had gone missing and had not returned after a few days. Her mother was not really concerned because she would do that often. She would go out for a few days and then she would come back. Family weren't really worried until several days would really pass. And then they were concerned and contacted police with a missing person report. Police would learn this person was most likely transported because they were tied up, and they believed that this person most likely knew her and was familiar with the area because they really had some time to carry out this crime. And here's the big clue that they really found. Forensics would find a hair that was intertwined in the rope, the knot that had been tied around her. They found this single strand of hair, and forensics would determine it was not human hair. It was actually from a dog. Now they're looking for a suspect that may be tied to a dog, that may have a dog or be around a dog. They start to interview people close to Misty. They interview a man named Brent Huck, and she was a friend, and he did happen to have a dog. He came from a wealthy family. He would go on to tell police that he did have sex with Misty, but that they were no longer together in a relationship. They were more of a friends with benefits type of situation. He would go on to tell police that she was seeing another man, and police would look at this other man. They're leaving no stone unturned. They're looking at this other person who's identified as some sort of tough guy. They quickly learn that he doesn't have a boat, he doesn't have any boating experience, he has no dog. They rule him out. Alibi checks out, he's just not a person of interest. And so they look at some other people, same thing. People that had no vehicle, no resources, no boat, alibis would check out. So they would rule out multiple people, but then they would turn their attention back to Brent Huck. Hey, if you're really digging this content, one way you can really support me is by searching Crime Hive on social media. If you visit my YouTube, my TikTok, or even my Instagram, you can comment, share, and like the posts. This would mean a lot, and I appreciate your support. 1, they already knew that he had a dog. 2, they learned some disturbing information about his past. They learned that he had been in the Navy before, but he had a bad discharge. I don't know if it was a dishonorable or a bad conduct discharge, but he was discharged from the military because of some problems, some attitude issues that he had. He apparently bragged to others that he was a Navy SEAL, but this was false. This was false information. And again, I've talked about this before, that when police determine deception, that small deception really piques their interest and it becomes a red flag. And so they really are interested in understanding more about this Brent Huck individual. And so they keep looking into his past. They learned that he wanted to be a captain. He knew the waters well. He knew a lot about boats. And again, he had resources to be able to commit a crime like this. So they end up going to his house to interview him. It's actually near the river where Misty's body was found, so it's pretty close in proximity. His parents are away, out of town apparently, and police are greeted by a dog right away. And so they end up taking, I believe, 50 hairs. So they took a lot of hair samples from this dog to compare. They start, interviewing Brent and looking around the property. He's allowing them to look. Police would later talk about the fact that he believed he was smarter than everyone else. And so he essentially just allowed police to come into his home and he just thought he would be able to outsmart them. And police would quickly find a crumpled up piece of white duct tape, identical to that found on Misty's body. They would locate that on his dresser. And then in the kitchen, they would find grocery bags that were identical to the ones used to weigh down her body, had the same number system stamped on them, so the manufacturer was the same. This totality of evidence is really allowing police to make an arrest, even with limited information that he's completely tied to it. They have a circumstantial case. They would find nylon rope that was, again, similar to the same type of rope that was used to bind her hands and feet. And then the lab would ultimately confirm later on that the dog hair was consistent with the breed of dog that was found on scene with Brent Huck. They used mitochondrial DNA to determine that information. With all of that evidence that I just mentioned, that was enough for them to arrest Brent Huck. So they actually arrested him on this circumstantial evidence case. In October of 2002, he was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. In court, we would learn about the motive or potential motive with this crime. Brent, apparently, the night Misty went missing, was at a bar with friends, and he learned that Misty was possibly pregnant with his child. He was recently engaged at this time. Police believe that he was angry, called her from that bar based on this rumor of pregnancy. Police would later test Misty and actually determine that she was not pregnant, but believe that Brent thought that this was the case. He would later pick up Misty, bind her, tape her eyes and mouth shut with this white duct tape, and he would throw her out into the river, into this deep part of it, to kill her and get rid of the possibility that he was going to have this child with her. The scary thing about this case is that she most likely was alive when she was thrown out into the water due to the lack of injuries that she had. Brent was hoping that she would just sink to the bottom and never be found, and he would go back to his life. Although I believe his engagement was broken up because of this possible rumor with her pregnancy, with Misty's pregnancy. He was found guilty in trial, and I think an interesting twist to this entire case is that Misty apparently had given Brent that dog as a gift. The dog that ultimately convicted Brent. That evidence was very strong against him. He would ultimately be convicted and serve a life sentence for this crime.
Crime Hive. True Crime Buzz.